It began with a scoff and concluded with a phenomenon that brought even the most hardened Marine to his knees. Stick with this narrative. For the instant Jack Thompson ridiculed the Virgin Mary, an ancient force started to awaken. Jack Thompson had never been one for prayer. He was born into a difficult district in Detroit, a place where derelict structures far outnumbered fortunate occurrences. Jack learned early that survival wasn't bestowed from above. It was achieved through clenched fists and a thick hide. By the age of 12, he could outpace a street brawl. By 15, he had ceased believing in anything intangible. He considered God to be a mere crutch for the feeble, something his mother had long since abandoned. She worked grueling double shifts at a laundry facility, returning home reeking of bleach and weariness, drowning her sorrows with generous measures of cheap whiskey. They never frequented a church. The sole crucifix in their home hung precariously above the stove, tarnished by years of grease and neglect. When Jack once inquired about it, she merely sneered, dismissing it as a relic from his grandmother. And that was the end of that discussion. Consequently, by the time he enlisted in the U.S. Marine Corps at 18, Jack carried a hardened spirit and a penchant for sarcasm. What others termed faith, he dismissed as a delusion for the weak, a fanciful story. Boot camp did little to alter his perspective. If anything, it honed his abrasive nature. Jack excelled in physical conditioning, firearms proficiency, and commanding quietude through sheer presence. However, whenever he observed recruits clutching scapulars or murmuring Hail Marys before a jump, he couldn't resist a barb. "Hey, Martinez," he once bellowed across the tarmac. "Ask your holy lady if she's got earplugs for this next blast." Laughter invariably followed. Jack didn't subscribe to belief in saints, angels, or God, let alone the Virgin Mary, whom he irreverently labeled a holy doll. That remark often earned him a drink or two among his peers. The more sacrilegious his comment, the louder their amusement. It became a ritual. He would identify anything sacred and shatter it with words. Yet the nature of rituals is their transition into habits. And habits, left unchecked, become identity. In every unit Jack served with, whether in Afghanistan, Guam, or back at Fort Bragg, he solidified his reputation. He was the one who always had a cutting remark about religion. He was the one who rolled his eyes when soldiers sought blessings from the chaplain. He was the one who flicked holy cards from lockers, proclaiming, "She won't save you, your rifle will." Then arrived a mission in El Paso, near the border. It was the middle of December, unusually warm for winter, with a dry desert wind that parched the skin. The town was preparing for the feast day of Our Lady of Guadalupe, a tradition Jack neither comprehended nor valued. The streets teemed with families, children clutching candles, grandmothers adorned with veils, and young men carrying statues with trembling hands. Melodies in Spanish drifted through the air like fragrant smoke. Jack stood by, chewing gum, his AR-15 slung casually, sharing a laugh with another corporal. "What's with all the fanfare?" he smirked. "They act like she's going to materialize on Main Street and settle their debts." He didn't notice the elderly man until the laughter subsided. The man wore a faded brown jacket, a rosary coiled around one hand like a protective charm. His eyes, however, belied the lines etched on his face. They were sharp, ancient. He approached, closer than Jack found comfortable, and spoke in a voice that was low but unwavering. "You mock that which you do not comprehend. One day, soldier, you will call out to her. I only hope it will not be too late." Jack smirked and leaned in. "When I require assistance, I'll contact base command, not some silent effigy in a blue dress." The old man remained unmoved. He merely offered a somber, knowing nod, and departed. That encounter should have been insignificant, just another sermon from a devout local. But something about those eyes lingered. Something about his lack of anger, replaced by a profound disappointment, as if witnessing a man walk into a blizzard without an overcoat. Back at the base, Jack recounted the incident as a humorous anecdote. "Some old guy tried to spook me with a ghost story. Said I'd need his holy doll someday. Laughter erupted once more. Yet that night, a flicker danced in the shadows of his tent. Something frigid, something that felt like a distinct presence. He dismissed it, merely the wind, just the desert's stillness, just his imagination. But the desert retains its memories, as does the Virgin. And Jack's laughter, so resonant, so assured, had already begun to chip away at a facade poised to shatter. For faith needs no vocal proclamations. It often waits in silence until the inevitable downfall commences. There was an aspect of belief that unsettled Jack Thompson, not from apprehension, but because he perceived it as concealed weakness. Across every deployment, from the humid rainforests of the Pacific to the arid expanses of Nevada's desert ranges, he observed fellow soldiers clinging to their crucifixes as if they were lifelines. Some whispered prayers before embarking on missions. Others secured rosaries within their bootlaces or tapped their scapulars thrice before boarding Humvees. Jack never grasped this behavior, nor did he care to. To him, faith was a prosthetic limb with no skeletal structure to support. Corporal David Ramos, a first-generation Mexican-American, had a custom of reciting the rosary before each nocturnal patrol, always with a gentle voice and unfailing respect. But Jack detested the sound of those beads slipping through fingers in the darkness, like superstitious whispers against the walls of his reality. "Ramos," Jack would taunt, "do you believe that necklace will deflect a bullet?" Ramos never responded. He simply continued his prayers with steadfast, silent devotion. This infuriated Jack more than any verbal retort. It was akin to being disregarded by an apparition. Then there was the newcomer, Private Jalen Pierce. Fresh from basic training, his eyes were wide, and his manners were courteous. He carried a small plastic effigy of the Virgin Mary in his pocket, stating it had belonged to his grandmother. During briefings, he would rub it between his fingers as if it were a worry stone. Jack noticed and ridiculed him. "Are you going to bring her to the shooting range too, Pierce?" he asked. Pierce stammered. "Sir, I mean, if she's guarding you, we might as well leave the Kevlar behind." Pierce flushed but offered no further reply. The room erupted in chuckles. That was Jack's fort, not rank, but dominance through public humiliation. His preferred target, however, was religion itself. One evening, during a power outage at the outpost, a group of soldiers gathered around a single lantern, sharing stories to pass the time. The conversation turned to miracles, minor ones, nothing extraordinary. A cousin's recovery from cancer, a brother surviving a crash that should have proven fatal. Jack listened for a moment, then smirked. "You ever notice how your deity only intervenes when the cameras are off and the doctors are baffled?" A strained silence followed, broken by a forced laugh from someone attempting to ease the tension. Jack leaned back on his cot, arms crossed, a look of smug satisfaction on his face. That was his sermon, sarcasm trumping salvation. Even the chaplains were not exempt. When Chaplain Monroe arrived at the base chapel, exuding a tranquil demeanor and clutching a leather-bound Bible, Jack made it a point to sit in the back row, solely to interject. "Let me guess," he whispered during one sermon. "Today's homily is about why God permits infants to perish, isn't it?" The chaplain offered no verbal response, merely casting a glance at Jack, a flicker of sadness in his eyes. Jack grinned as if he had scored a decisive point. However, beneath the veneer of mockery, beneath the hardened jaw and crossed arms, lay a deep-seated unease. Every time healing was mentioned, Jack recalled his mother's solitary passing in a hospice bed while nuns sang hymns in the corridor. He remembered a moment at 14, when he had prayed to an empty void, pleading for relief from his suffering, and received only silence in return. Thus, he constructed fortifications, reinforced them with barbed wire, and then adorned them with jests. To the world, Jack appeared as a man untouched by reverence. To himself, he was a man untouched by any reciprocal response. During one particular December, the base organized a volunteer excursion to a small town in New Mexico to aid in the community's procession for Our Lady of Guadalupe. Jack's participation was solely motivated by the rumors of available tamales, an excellent tequila. He arrived just as barefoot mothers were lighting candles, children in white garments bearing roses, and an elderly woman was kneeling in tears before a statue of the Virgin Mary. Jack scoffed. "This is what they call faith," he muttered. "It looks more like destitution draped in verse." His comrade, Sergeant Miller, nudged him. "Don't be a lout. These individuals have faith. Let them have it." Jack shrugged. "Belief doesn't cover rent." Then, as if punctuating his statement, he inadvertently knocked over a candle, extinguishing its flame. A woman behind him gasped. "Was that a promise?" she whispered. Jack chuckled. "Then I suppose your promise has just expired." She remained silent. She simply made the sign of the cross and turned away, her fingers white from clutching her rosary so tightly. From a distance of several yards, a familiar figure observed. Don Raphael, the same elderly man from the previous procession. His gaze met Jack's with the same serene certainty, as though he had witnessed this precise moment unfold before. He made no move to approach, deeming it unnecessary. His silence resonated more profoundly than any insult. Back at the base that night, Jack lay on his cot, replaying the scene without understanding why. The woman's gasp, the candle's extinguished flame, the old man's unwavering stare. He attempted to sleep, but a single phrase echoed in his mind. "Someday, you will call out to her. I only hope it will not be too late." He let out a self-amused chuckle in the darkness, but the sound fell flat. It felt hollow. Initially, the manifestations were subtle, minor occurrences easily dismissed by any skeptic. It commenced during a night patrol in the canyons of Sierra Blanca, where the wind howled with greater intensity than the radio transmissions. Jack Thompson was leading a reconnaissance unit of 5 men. It was routine surveillance. No threats were anticipated, only dust, silence, and the characteristic tedium of military operations. The first anomaly occurred when Private Pierce, the same young man possessing the plastic Virgin Mary statue, knelt to adjust a loose boot strap. As he stood, his hand brushed the soil, uncovering something. A rosary, buried barely an inch beneath the earth. Worn, but intact. The crucifix still glinted. Jack rolled his eyes. "Desert debris," he mumbled, but Pierce's tone was different. "It wasn't here before," he stated. "I swear I traversed this path 3 times today." The following day, their Jeep's battery inexplicably died. Subsequently, the replacement radio fell silent. The local guide, an experienced patrol scout, attributed the events to the land being unsettled during this particular season, offering no concrete explanation. By the 3rd night, a discernible shift occurred. In the midst of a dry riverbed encampment, Corporal Ramos awoke in a cold sweat, his cot thoroughly soaked. He recounted a dream, vivid and distressing, impossible to articulate. He described a woman clad in blue robes, standing amidst a field of ash. Her gaze was unblinking, her hands motionless, yet she looked directly at him. "I couldn't breathe," he whispered to Pierce, "as if she were inside me, reading my very essence." Jack overheard and interjected harshly, "Yeah, did she advise you to improve your dental hygiene?" Ramos remained silent, his gaze fixed on the desert horizon as if something were observing him. However, even Jack could not ignore the palpable alteration in the atmosphere. The canyon, typically arid and lifeless, suddenly exuded a sweet fragrance. Not perfume, not flowers, but an indefinable scent, reminiscent of roses carried on a warm breeze. It persisted for mere moments before vanishing. A peculiar aroma in the midst of isolation. Then came the spectral visions. Pierce reported glimpsing a figure one night, a woman standing motionless between 2 rock formations, no movement, no sound, only an ethereal aura surrounding her head. Jack directed his flashlight beam toward the location, prepared to shout or even fire if necessary. Nothing was present, yet Pierce trembled uncontrollably, unable to speak. The final incident, at least concerning Jack's composure, involved the compass. He was verifying bearings for their return trek when the needle began to rotate, slowly at first, then in full circles, as if it had malfunctioned. He tapped it, shook it, and retrieved a second compass from the survival kit. The outcome was identical. They weren't precisely lost, but the desert terrain seemed to have shifted. "Could be a magnetic anomaly," he muttered dismissively. No one contradicted him. No one wished to articulate the unsettling feeling that had begun to permeate the group. That night, as Jack lay in his tent, attempting to logically rationalize the week's peculiar events, he found himself wide awake at precisely 3 minutes past 3 in the morning. Something was scratching at the tent's exterior. Not the sound of claws or branches, but a rhythmic scraping, akin to fingernails on canvas. He held his breath. Then, the sound ceased. He flung open the flap. Nothing but sand and shadow greeted him. However, directly at the entrance, etched into the dirt with a fingertip, was the perfect, undisturbed outline of a single cross. He divulged this to no one. For the first time in years, Jack did not laugh. He did not utter a word. He simply zipped up the tent and lay in the darkness, his gaze fixed on the void. Because suddenly, for all his ingrained logic, his sharp wit, and his outward bravado, he was no longer certain whether he was the observer or the observed. It was the 4th night in the canyon. The atmosphere had become charged, almost electric. It was so still it seemed to hum. The customary desert sounds, the calls of coyotes, the rustling of leaves, even the whisper of the wind, had completely vanished. The silence now possessed a palpable weight, dense and heavy, as if some ancient entity had entered the camp without the need to breach any physical barrier. At precisely 3 minutes past 3 in the morning, Jack Thompson sat bolt upright in his tent, his eyes wide, his body drenched in sweat. No dream had roused him. There had been no time for such a precursor. He had simply felt an invisible force drawing him awake. Outside, the moon was obscured by a thick blanket of fog, an anomaly given the typical dryness of this region of New Mexico. Yet the fog was present, creeping between the rocks like ethereal smoke from an unseen fire. Private Pierce stirred near the dying embers of the campfire, clutching his small religious figurine tighter, but he remained silent. He dared not speak. Jack fumbled for his flashlight, his thumb trembling as he pressed the rubberized activation button. The beam flickered weakly, then extinguished. Moments later, he perceived her. Initially, she was merely a silhouette at the periphery of the camp, standing with absolute stillness on a low ridge, no taller than a pickup truck. No wind stirred her cloak, and no dust adhered to her form. The luminescence surrounding her did not originate from the moon. Indeed, it seemed to emanate from nowhere tangible. It was she, a tall figure draped in a blue mantle adorned with gold, as if the night sky itself had been meticulously stitched into her attire. Beneath the mantle, she wore a simple, unwrinkled white dress. Her hands were clasped serenely before her. Her face. Jack struggled to discern every detail, noting only that she did not blink and her gaze was fixed upon him. He took a step forward, his boot sinking deeper into the sand than expected. Another step followed. His breathing grew shallow, the ambient temperature plummeted. No one else stirred. It was as if time itself had paused, and the desert was holding its collective breath. As Jack reached the ridge, he paused. She stood no more than 10 feet away, unmoving, her presence impossibly tranquil. Not empty, but profoundly full, imbued with something beyond his capacity to articulate. It was not a sense of threat or judgment, but a sorrow, a melancholy so profound it felt older than spoken language. Jack's hand instinctively twitched toward his sidearm, not from perceived danger, but from ingrained habit. Yet, as he reached, he found himself unable to lift his arm. He was not paralyzed, merely rendered powerless. Her eyes held him captive, not as a prisoner, but as a child might be regarded. Suddenly, Every disparaging word he had ever directed at her, every jest, every insult, every act of disrespect surged back into his consciousness like a river of scorched remnants. He recalled the candle he had kicked, the old man's dire warning, the echoing laughter, the casual dismissal, and somehow she remembered it all. Yet she did not accuse. She did not flinch. She simply stood there, a silent witness to his internal unraveling. Then Jack stumbled, not from fear, nor from awe, but from the sheer weight of her presence. His boot caught on a loose stone, sending him crashing to the dirt, his shoulder striking the ground first, scraping against the rough rock. His head collided with something sharp. Darkness enveloped him. When he regained consciousness, dawn had broken. Ramos was gently shaking his shoulder. "Thompson, are you all right?" Jack blinked, his throat parched, his heart still pounding erratically. "I saw," he began, then faltered. Ramos leaned closer. "What?" Jack's voice cracked with emotion. "She was here. And for the first time since our deployment began, no one laughed. No one spoke. They all felt it." Lying on the ground near Jack's outstretched hand was a freshly bloomed flower, a single white rose, its petals soft and full, untouched by dust or dew. It was not a bloom native to this desert environment, nor was it found in anyone's pack. Its origin remained a mystery. That morning, Jack remained silent. He issued no commands. He offered no derisive remarks. He simply sat by the fire, the rose cradled in his hand, gazing at the sky, pondering whether she was still observing him, and deep within, he knew she was. By mid-morning, the patrol unit had commenced its descent from the ridge, a palpable silence and unease accompanying them, carrying burdens far heavier than their standard gear. No one spoke of the previous night's events, nor did anyone mention the white rose discovered near Jack Thompson's hand. Yet each man cast more frequent glances over his shoulder than usual. Even the wind seemed altered, gentler, imbued with a sense of reverence, as if the desert itself had borne witness to something sacred. Jack walked towards the rear of the group, one hand unconsciously brushing against the pocket where he had carefully placed the flower. He had refrained from informing anyone that it had not wilted, even after hours exposed to the relentless heat. At the steepest section of the trail, where barren rock gave way to loose scree, the group slowed their pace. The incline steepened dramatically. A single misstep could send a man hurtling 40 feet down into an abyss of jagged boulders and thorny undergrowth. They proceeded with extreme caution until Jack's boot snagged on a gnarled root. It happened in an instant. A cry, a slip, then the world tilted sideways. Thompson tumbled over the edge. Ramos lunged in his direction, narrowly missing him. Jack's body careened down the rocky slope, impacting the terrain with brutal force. His arm struck a ledge with a sickening crunch. His leg twisted backward at an unnatural angle, eliciting a pained exclamation from one of the soldiers. Then, silence descended. When the team reached him 20 minutes later, Jack lay motionless in a shallow ravine, partially obscured by red dust. His right leg was clearly fractured, the bone protruding through the skin, blood saturating the fabric of his uniform. His eyes were open, dazed, his breathing shallow. "Don't move," Pierce whispered, kneeling beside him, but Jack made no attempt to comply. He could not. The overwhelming pain had incapacitated him, yet remarkably, he emitted no cries of agony. Instead, he wept, not from physical torment, but from a deeper, more profound source. As Ramos radioed for a medevac, Pierce sat close to Jack, gently taking his hand. "You'll be all right," he murmured softly. Jack offered no reply. Only one word formed on his lips. "Her." The helicopter arrived 40 minutes later, its rotor blades churning the dust into a tempestuous vortex. Jack was carefully placed onto a stretcher, losing consciousness by the time they reached the airstrip. He was transported to a military hospital in El Paso, where trauma surgeons briefed the emergency room team, preparing them for a severe compound fracture and significant blood loss. However, the expected injuries were absent. Upon cutting through the fabric of his uniform, his leg appeared entirely normal, not merely healed, but completely unscathed. There was no bruising, no swelling, no indication of any fracture, no evidence of recent trauma. The emergency room nurse double-checked the patient's chart. "Are you certain this is the individual who experienced the fall?" she inquired. The medic from the field team nodded emphatically. "We witnessed the bone protrude. We saw the blood." A subsequent CT scan revealed nothing unusual, only scar tissue on his shoulder from an older injury, and nothing more. By the time Jack regained consciousness, 3 physicians were present, engaged in hushed discussion. One finally approached his bedside. "Mr. Thompson," the doctor stated cautiously, "we are unable to provide an explanation." Jack slowly sat up, glanced down at his leg, flexed his toes, then his ankle, experiencing no pain. The rose, still nestled in his pocket, remained perfectly intact. From the doorway, Ramos observed, his face pale, his voice quiet. "Jack," he said, "what occurred down there?" Jack did not respond immediately. He simply gazed at his leg, then whispered, not to Ramos, not to the doctors, but to an unseen presence, "Thank you." No one witnessed the woman in blue that day. No one recorded the event. There was no tangible proof. However, every man present on that patrol understood what they had seen before the fall, during the profound silence, and reflected in Jack's subsequent demeanor. And although not all of them would readily admit it, they now believed because something impossible had emerged from the desert, and it had walked alongside Jack. Jack Thompson returned to the base 2 days later. He wore the same boots, the same uniform, his jawline still sharp, his shoulders squared. But something within him had changed, becoming quieter. The way he carried himself, the manner in which he regarded his fellow soldiers, the unseen burden he bore. It was no longer a physical weight. It was something far more profound, something ancient, deeper than doubt. The others took notice. Ramos was the first to voice their collective observation. "He seems to be different," Pierce noted with a nod. Jack hadn't uttered a jest since their time in El Paso. Nobody dared to allude to the single white rose they had glimpsed tucked within Jack's journal, nor the peculiar habit he'd developed of touching his pocket before every briefing, as if checking for a compass, a guide not crafted from metal, but from memory. The first noticeable shift in his demeanor occurred subtly during a routine weapons inspection. Jack was observed lingering behind the Humvee, his eyes closed for a fraction longer than ordinary. When Sergeant Miller found him kneeling by the rear tire, a look of concern creased his brow. "Everything all right?" Jack slowly rose, brushing a bit of dust from his knee. "Just needed a moment," he replied. His words were few, yet the profound stillness that enveloped him spoke volumes. Later, during a standard patrol in the eastern sector, a quiet affair involving 5 men, arid conditions, and no signs of enemy activity, Jack drew Private Pierce aside before they commenced their journey. Reaching into his chest pocket, he produced a simple rosary, its black plastic beads strung on worn cord. Pierce, taken aback, inquired, "Where did you acquire that?" Jack glanced away briefly before handing it over, stating, "It's yours now." Pierce, with widened eyes, accepted the rosary. That particular day concluded without any complications, not a single communication malfunction, not one misstep. Some attributed the smooth operation to fortune, others to a subtle shift in a greater force. By the week's end, hushed conversations had become widespread. Thompson, once the most vocal skeptic, had fallen silent. He still maintained the rigorous discipline of a soldier, issuing sharp commands during drills and meticulously cleaning his rifle with the precision of someone who placed more faith in order than in discourse. However, at the mess hall, his posture had changed. He listened attentively and refrained from interrupting. When he overheard 2 junior recruits mocking the chaplain's sermon, he did not reprimand them. Instead, he quietly advised, "Exercise caution regarding whom you ridicule. Certain matters are observant." The moment when everyone else truly comprehended that an irreversible change had taken place arrived during the weekly duty rotation ceremony. Each squad was assigned new assignments. Jack's name was called once more for field duty. As he stood, he offered the customary salute, then paused. From his shirt pocket, he withdrew the same delicate white rose, preserved and intact. He placed it on the edge of the command table, declaring, "May this serve as a reminder that certain forces in this existence require not our understanding, but our reverence." A hush fell over the assembly. Even the lieutenant, known for his dismissal of any hint of superstition, lowered his gaze. Jack never lectured or preached. His transformation was evident in his very bearing, as though he were accompanied by an unseen presence. Prior to missions, he would spend 2 minutes in solitude behind the barracks. While some speculated he was meditating or praying, his true impact lay not in his private rituals, but in the subsequent actions of others. By the month's end, 3 additional soldiers were seen wearing rosaries, and 2 began carrying pocket-sized devotional cards featuring an image of Our Lady of Guadalupe, tucked amongst their gear. One even approached Jack discreetly, asking, "Do you believe she would offer me forgiveness?" Without hesitation, Jack simply nodded and responded, "She already has." The desert landscape remained unchanged, but Jack had transformed, and in the quiet wake he left behind, others began to listen. As spring approached, Jack Thompson had become an enigma, not a legendary figure, nor a phantom, but simply altered. Initially, people maintained a distance, not out of fear of his being dangerous, but because his newfound unpredictability unsettled them. In the structured environment of the military, the unexpected could be a source of unease. Yet gradually, his quietude evolved into a profound stillness that began to attract others. This shift commenced within the hospital ward. Jack had returned to the Veterans Affairs Medical Center, not for personal care, but drawn by an inner compulsion to connect with those who spent their days in silent rooms devoid of visitors and hope. He offered no sermons, no counsel, only tokens of remembrance. Sergeant Owen, a triple amputee who had been unresponsive for days following a resurgence of infection, found Jack seated beside his bed. For a full 20 minutes, they sat in shared silence. Before departing, Jack carefully placed a small, folded square on the bedside table. Within it was a well-worn image of Our Lady of Guadalupe, its edges softened with time. Initially, Owen did not acknowledge the picture, but later, when a nurse entered, she found him weeping softly, the image clutched tightly in his remaining hand. Word of these encounters spread. Some claimed Jack had miraculously survived a fall that should have been fatal, while others whispered of a luminous presence accompanying him through the canyon. Most were uncertain what to believe, but when the most hardened members of the unit began seeking out Jack's presence at their bunks, their eyes conveying unspoken questions, it became evident that whatever had transformed him was having a wider influence. During mail call one evening, a corporal from Kentucky named Delaney approached Jack after lights out. Standing in the darkness, uncertain, he confessed, "I doubt she heard me. Not after all I've done." Jack offered no inquiries, sensing the depth of his distress. He simply handed Delaney a small rosary carved from olive wood, its cross smoothed by extensive handling. "She is not waiting to chastise you," Jack assured him. "She is simply waiting." That night, Delaney wept, not with loud sobs, but with the quiet release of a man finally shedding a profound burden carried for years. Jack's outreach extended further. He began visiting various units, particularly after challenging deployments, not to issue directives, but to offer solace, a reassuring glance, or a silent prayer near the motor pool. He would place a gentle hand on a soldier's shoulder before a funeral detail. Subsequently, his visits expanded to hospitals. Every Friday, during his off-duty hours, Jack would board a bus for a 40-minute journey into Albuquerque to the Veterans Wing of St. Francis Hospital. He received no remuneration for these visits, and never wore his uniform. He simply entered with a satchel filled with printed cards, miniature rosaries, and prayer notes he had meticulously written throughout the week. While some patients rebuffed him, others cursed or mocked. A few showed signs of emotional breakthrough, and it was with these individuals that Jack lingered the longest. In one particular room, an elderly veteran named Franklin, succumbing to lung cancer and estranged from his family for 12 years, refused the comfort of a chaplain or priest. However, when Jack sat beside him and placed a folded napkin on the tray table bearing only 3 words, "She never left," the old man stared intently for a full minute before asking, "Sit down." For 2 hours, their conversation revolved around maternal figures, not theological doctrines or saints, but simply mothers. 3 days later, when Franklin passed, he was holding a rosary in his left hand. Jack never referred to his efforts as a ministry or assigned them a formal title. Yet the quiet healing he fostered spread like a flickering flame in the darkness. There was no grand stage, no amplified voice, only faith conveyed from one wounded spirit to another. This transformation did not occur instantaneously. There were no organized rallies, no dramatic calls to repentance, and no preachers shouting from corners of the mess hall. However, inexplicably, without a single command or public announcement, a spiritual current began to flow through the base. At the heart of this quiet awakening stood Jack Thompson, never seeking a leadership role. It began in subtle ways. A rosary appearing on a nightstand where it hadn't been before. A candle lit in the chapel during off hours and left burning until morning, or a soldier standing alone at dusk outside the barracks, whispering barely audible words with bowed head and hands tucked into pockets. No one claimed to have initiated this movement, nor did anyone admit to imitating another. Nevertheless, echoes of something sacred began to reappear everywhere. In the motor pool, a folded prayer card was affixed to the inside of a supply cabinet. On the firing range, a small cross drawn in chalk appeared near the safety instructions, and no one removed it. Even in the gymnasium, between sets of pull-ups and barbell lifts, one could hear a quiet utterance. "Protect us, Mother. Keep us safe out there." Jack never claimed credit, often shrugging when asked, remarking that people were simply remembering. He never preached, content to simply live his truth, which, as it turned out, resonated more profoundly than any spoken words. Sergeant Miller, once dismissive of anything spiritual, was observed one morning wearing a bracelet of wooden beads. When a jibe was made, he simply tapped it twice and replied, "It's not merely for appearance." Corporal Delaney, after months of silence, began leaving anonymous notes on bunks, each containing a scriptural passage or a prayer, without signature or explanation, simply truth folded once and placed beneath a pillow. The chapel, typically deserted except for holidays, began to attract visitors. It wasn't crowded, but it pulsed with a quiet vitality. A soldier might slip in during his lunch break, sit alone for 10 minutes, and then depart. Another would kneel at the back pew before a deployment, kissing a metal pendant around her neck. There was no ostentation, no audible sound, only a palpable presence. Some commanders took notice. One even approached Jack and inquired, "What precisely is your involvement here, Thompson?" Jack met his gaze directly and responded, "Nothing, sir. Merely remembering our true selves." The commander offered no reply, but the following day he briefly visited the chapel to light a candle. The influence even extended to the mailroom. A young recruit from Ohio started receiving handwritten prayers from his grandmother. Instead of discarding them as he usually did, he began posting them on the bulletin board. Within a week, others contributed their own. A verse, a line from a hymn, a name scrawled in shaky ink with the words, "Pray for him," underlined twice. The bulletin board transformed into something entirely different, a tapestry of quiet hope. Then, an unexpected moment occurred. During a morning ceremony, as the flag was hoisted and the national anthem filled the air, every soldier present dropped to one knee. This was not an act of protest or political statement, but a silent acknowledgement that a comrade had fallen in the field. No orders were issued, no announcement made, yet the courtyard fell into an absolute stillness, as if even the wind held its breath. In that profound silence, Jack stood at the edge of the formation, hand over his heart, his gaze lifted not to the flag, but to something beyond it, something eternal, something maternal. Faith, it transpired, required no amplification. It needed neither marching bands nor viral speeches. It simply awaited a vulnerability, a willingness to kneel. Years elapsed. The uniform grew faded, the boots worn. Jack Thompson's name transitioned quietly from active duty rosters to veteran outreach logs. There was no formal farewell ceremony, no parade, just a folded flag, a signature on a discharge document, and a nod of acknowledgement from the few who truly understood his profound transformation. However, Jack's service never truly concluded. His mission had merely evolved. He now navigated the streets of Albuquerque with the same composed demeanor he'd exhibited on base, steady, observant, and purposeful. His instruments were no longer bullets or strategies, but rosaries carried in his coat pocket, prayer cards in his satchel, and a voice that, rather than issuing commands, whispered peace. Every Tuesday, Jack visited St. Luke's Medical Center, not for personal treatment, but to sit in quiet companionship beside beds occupied by those with no other visitors. There, he held hands with amputees, patients with Alzheimer's, and quiet men whose eyes remained fixed on invisible conflicts playing out across the sterile ceilings. He shared no combat anecdotes, offered no definitive solutions, but listened intently. Before departing, he would often place a small card into their hands, bearing no name. Only 3 words. She never left. At the local elementary school, he read stories to children who had fathers absent from their lives. At the VA shelter in the downtown area, he served coffee before dawn, and once a month he returned to the very canyon where his transformation had begun. He went alone, before sunrise, simply to kneel in the dust and offer a silent thank you. He never claimed to have divine visions or to perform miracles. However, those closest to him could discern a tangible presence. It was evident in the way silence seemed to trail him like a second shadow, the way strangers would weep after mere minutes in his company, and the way even the most hardened cynics departed his presence with a tremor in their hands, as if recalling a mother with whom they hadn't spoken in years. Then came the call. Sergeant Julius Garrison, once the most vociferous blasphemer Jack had ever encountered, was nearing the end of his life in a VA hospice facility 2 states away. He had no visitors, no chaplain, but one singular request: send Jack. Though no one understood how the word had reached him, Jack went. The room was dim, with machines emitting a low hum like distant thunder. Julius, frail and emaciated, slowly turned his head as Jack entered. His eyes were moist, his voice barely a whisper. "You were right about her," he murmured. Jack remained silent, instead withdrawing a worn scapular from his jacket and gently placing it over Julius's chest. Julius closed his eyes and whispered, "Tell her I'm sorry." Jack leaned closer. "She already knows," he replied. 2 hours later, Julius passed away, and for the first time in years, the attending nurses noted a smile on his face. Jack never publicized his experiences, nor did he author any memoirs, yet the tales of his actions circulated like a pervasive wind, from military barracks to hospital wards, from prison chapels to nursing homes. He became known as the soldier who had seen the Blessed Mother, the man who had fallen and risen again with a profound light in his eyes. In his modest home, Jack displayed only one item on his wall, not medals or photographs, but a simple framed card bearing the inscription, "While I breathe, I will remind the world that you wait." On his final birthday, Jack returned one last time to the canyon trail. Ramos accompanied him, older now and moving slower, but his loyalty remained unwavering. They stood in silent contemplation as the sun ascended over the ridgeline. Then Jack quietly remarked, "It was never about proving anything." Ramos turned to him. Then, what was it about? Jack smiled, his eyes glistening. It was about reminding people they are never too distant to be forgiven. When Jack passed away later that year, the chapel at the VA was filled, not solely with soldiers, but with a diverse assembly of strangers. Men who had once derided faith, nurses who had long since lost hope, widows, children, doctors, and drifters. One by one, they approached and whispered, "He brought me back." And in the pocket of every individual who came to bid farewell was a rosary, some of plastic, some of wood, some handmade, all touched by the profound faith of one man. They did not bury him with fanfare. They buried him with a rose. A single white bloom was placed over his heart, mirroring the very first one he had received, back when he harbored doubt and readily dismissed such notions with laughter, back when he had fallen. He never pursued ordination, never led a religious revival, nor did he ever claim the title of saint. Yet, somewhere between his fall and his eventual forgiveness, he became a beacon of light. Therefore, if this narrative has resonated with you, if it has stirred something deep within, if you have ever ridiculed that which you now profoundly miss, or doubted that which now feels palpable, understand this: she is ever waiting. And some missions do not conclude when the uniform is shed. Some are only just beginning. If this story has moved you, please subscribe to Touched by Grace, for there are countless hearts yet to be healed, more stories awaiting their telling, and a luminescence that continues to be passed on.